Not sure where everybody is, but we will get started.
Morning, Rabbi.
Good morning. All right, let's see here. Okay, so we are just going over the Imrei Yaakov on the halacha of trying to save my own property at the expense of my neighbor's property. If my neighbor's property is damaging my property, then I'm allowed to save my property, even if it means damaging my neighbor's property. But I'm obligated at the same time to minimize the damage to the greatest degree as possible. And the example that the Rav Shulchan Aruch had given to this is let's say his animal is jumping on top of my animal, and they're two large animals. So if I was to push the larger animal, I might, that's on top, I might injure it. So if I can just gently pull away my animal without pushing the other animal, that would be the preferred method. Okay. And then further, we saw that, if a person neglects to do so, he can be held liable only in a situation where there was no additional effort involved. But if there was additional effort involved to minimize the damage to my friend, so then I cannot be held liable in a beis din when I save my own property. So this actually was the thing that caused the Imrei Yaakov to say that the example that he gave in the biurim was if a guy's car is blocking traffic and we need to get past it. So if there's a way to minimize damage to his car and allow the traffic to start flowing again, fine. But if there's really no other way, it would be actually permitted to push his car with my car, even knowing that his car will be damaged in the process. Okay. So now let's take a look. And by the way, I don't even know what secular law would say in that situation. I to be honest, I'm not sure, but at least this is what the halacha would say. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov so far. And in Sifkatan Chaf Aleph, Sifkatan Yud Tes, B'leired imo ledin. You're not. Oh yeah, we saw this yesterday. So we're up to Sifkatan Chaf Aleph. Shor Chavero. So let's say my friend's ox jumps on top of my ox. And he says here that there's a lot of information missing in this halacha, which is just basic information about the types of damage that animals can do and what the owners of those animals are liable for. And he writes, Harav Hishmit Bidvarav Dine Nizke Behema. He says the Rav Shulchan Aruch really leaves out some of the general principles of damages through animals. V'navi kan kama yisodos. We will bring certain principles. Kasav harambam, shlosha avos nezikin bashor. The Rambam writes that there are three categories of damage related to an ox. And that's the way that our sages described three categories of damage. And as you'll see in just a moment, they're not arbitrary categories. There's three different behaviors that animals can perform that our sages were cognizant of. One is what we would call malicious behavior. The second one is called behavior that is based on the animal's desire for food or pleasure. And the third category is the damage that an animal causes in the course of just walking. Sometimes if you have a large animal and it walks in a narrow space, it's invariably going to cause damage if there are fragile objects. Like if you let a bull loose in a china shop, the proverbial bull in a china shop, the bull is not acting maliciously. It's not there to try and gratify itself in any way, but just letting it walk into the china shop is inevitable that the bull is going to cause damage to the china. So those are the three categories, and you'll see how the rabbis identified these three categories. They call it Keren, Shane, and Regel. The first category is called the horn of the animal. They identified these three categories by the different parts of the animal's body. The second category is called the tooth of the animal, the tooth, because that's what an animal eats with. And the third category is regel, its leg. So let's explain. The nikru avos mipnei she'em ksuvim b'pasuk v'lahem toldos shekol davar hadomalo mikol ela nikru toldos. He says the reason why they're called avos nezikin is they're the header categories that are identified as such by the Torah. Okay, so these three, and they have subcategories as well. So, or things that are akin to them that are not identified in the pasuk. So toldos hakeren, anything that is akin to keren, which is the horn that an ox gores with or a bull gores with, they are nigifa, nishicha, revitza, beita. Included in that category is pushing, biting, forcefully pushing down with its body, and kicking. In all of these examples, the animal is maliciously trying to cause injury. Okay, and the reason why it's in its own separate category is that in many instances, when you're dealing with domesticated farm animals like cows or donkeys, it's not generally expected that an animal is out of the blue going to behave maliciously, because these animals are normally docile, and if they're not provoked, there's no reason to assume that they're going to be dangerous. Occasionally, you'll have a donkey, when it gets scared and someone stands behind it, that person better be very careful, because that can actually be a very dangerous situation. Never stand behind a mule or a donkey, right? I learned that just from watching enough TV shows, right? But there are certain animals like horses and cows that we would not expect them to be violent. And that's why there's less of a level of responsibility when an animal acts out in a malevolent way, because that's unexpected behavior. But now the last two categories, there's a greater level of liability, because these animals are just acting like normal farm animals. So the second category is shane, which is the animal's tooth, meaning that an animal will, when it sees food, will naturally want to eat it. And so if my animal goes over to someone's azaleas or to someone's fruit tree or vegetable patch and starts eating it, so then the owner is fully liable, because the animal is acting in a normal way. The owner has a responsibility to restrain the animal. So kol hadoma lazeh shemazik b'davar shenenes hitoldos hashem. So he says, any time the animal is acting based on its desire to gratify itself, kagon im nischachacha b'kosa lahaniyasa v'hizika b'chichucha. So another example is not only if an animal bites with its teeth to eat something, but let's say an animal sees a wall and it rubs up against the wall because it has an itch that it wishes to scratch. So the animal is not being malicious, but it's natural for that animal to want to just scratch itself against the wall. If you were an animal, you would do the same thing. Even the nicest of animals do this. And let's say in the course of rubbing itself against the wall, it damages the wall. Okay? V'chein im tanfa peros, or let's say it dirties produce. Let's say in the course of just wanting to smell the produce, it puts its snout against them, or it defecates on them. Va'ochlim lahanayasa, or if it eats produce for its own benefit. In all of these cases, it's just acting like an animal that typically sees something that it wants to gratify itself and does so. Kegon shenisgalgala aleihem. Or let's say an animal wants to just roll around in something on the ground that happens to be very gratifying sensually for the animal. And it turns out that it's, your prize, who knows what, something very, very valuable that it decides that it's going to roll around in, and it destroys all of your stuff. Okay, so that's the second category. And the third category is toldos haregel, is where the animal is not intentionally doing anything, just walking through a space, and it damages. Hizika begufa derech uhu davar shedarka bekach, and this is the most normal behavior of an animal. Ve'ein la bahana, and it's not getting any gratification from its action. B'chol hadoma lidvarim elu kagon shehizika b'sa'ara derech hilucha. So, for example, as certain animals have hair, long hair. Let's say, certain kinds of sheep, right? So the sheep is walking through, and its hair is long and frizzy, and it ends up pulling something off the side of the road. Oshe kishkisha biznava, or the tail of the animal. Because animals have normal reflexes in the tail, and the animal is walking by a marketplace where there's a guy selling dishes, and the animal just snaps with its tail just instinctively, or maybe because it's swatting a fly or something, and it ends up breaking a whole set of dishes. Or if the animal has a saddle on its back, and the saddle knocks against something. Or any other apparatus that is attached to the animal. Let's say its bridle that is in its mouth, or the bell that is on its neck. If any of these things knock against something that's in the animal's way, again, that's the normal way that the animal walks. Or let's say a donkey is walking with a load on its back, and that load hits something that's near it on the road. The egla shemoshechet shehizika bishat meshichata, or a calf is pulling, let's say, a small wagon or something like that, and it damaged the wagon, damaged something. Okay, kol elu toldos haregel hein. So all of these things are subcategories of regel. So I think we've seen clearly why Chazal categorized these three different forms of damage, and what is the halach in these three forms of damage. Uvirshus harabim peturim, uvirshus hanizik mishalmin nezek shalem. So in the last two categories, if the animal damages in a public area, so the owner is blameless, the owner of the animal is blameless, because since this is a public area and everyone has a right to traverse this area, then it's up to every single individual to watch his property and make sure that it doesn't get hit by a cow, right? So if you're traveling with fragile items in a Rishus Harabim, it's you, the owner of the fragile items, who has to be careful, knowing full well that there are animals that are traversing this space. And you've got to be certain that you have to protect your items. Similarly, if you've got a bunch of carrots in your cart, and you know that any horse that walks by that cart is going to be tempted to nibble on the carrots, it's your responsibility as the guy with the carrots to protect your carrots. Okay, if the damage happens in the domain of the damagee, of the person, if it's in a private area, and it happens in the property of the damaged party, right? So then the halacha is mishalmin ezek shalom. So in all three categories, you have to pay full damages. You have to pay full damages because what was your animal doing on my property? It had no right to be on my property. You have an obligation to make sure that your animal doesn't go on private property. Now, but now the question is, on a practical basis, and this is a quote from the Rambam, he says, Behema shehizika b'shein v'regel hareza dvar matsui u'megabin oto gam bizman hazeh av she'ein lanu dayanim smuchin be'eretz Yisrael. So in the latter two categories of shein and regel, because it's a very prevalent kind of situation where animals will damage in order to gratify themselves or just in the course of walking. So because it's so prevalent, then when that damage is caused on the injured party's property, so then that's collectible even today. So if your dog or your other kind of animal wanders onto my property and it starts eating my food, or it starts digging up some of my plants, dogs will do that sometimes. They'll dig up stuff, right? So even bisman hazeh, even today, that is something that you can sue for in a beis din and be awarded, okay? And this does not require expert judges who got proper smicha in Eretz Yisrael, where there are some halachic issues where the rabbis say that there are finer points of halacha that require more expert judges. That does not hold true in this case. Aval behema shechavla bechaverta o shehizika es ha'adam ein govin nizko bizman hazeh. But by contrast, if an animal gores maliciously or in any other way uses the first form of damage, which is the damage of Karen, the horn, and it injures an animal or another human being, injures or kills, I should say, so that damage is not collectible nowadays. She'ein lanu dayanim samuchim. And as the Shulchan Aruch writes, today we don't have expert judges who can make a proper evaluation that this was definitely the fault of the owner. And sometimes it's very difficult to know. And he says, Va'ain lekaman simin tes sif tes vav. And we'll see later on when we discuss this issue in simin tes or in simin ches. So we'll see later on when personal damage is brought to an individual. So we're talking about where property is damaged. In the next chapter, we'll talk about where the person himself is injured by my friend or by my friend's property. We'll talk about this a little bit more then. I guess it's important to note that this is only true that you cannot collect from a goring animal if the animal's behavior is uncharacteristic, so that it's a farm animal, right? But let's say a person owns a pit bull, okay? If a person owns a pit bull or some other kind of violent dog that is constantly kept on its chain because it has a history of being violent or it's breeded as a species of dog to be violent, so that's not where the halach is addressing right now. And that's the last statement over here. Hamishaseh kalbo shel chavero b'chavero. Let's say, okay, Ruvain. Let me bring in the cast of characters. Shimon has a malicious dog. Shimon has a pit bull, and Ruvain has a poodle. Okay, and Shimon and Levi six the pit bull that belongs to Shimon against Ruvain's poodle. Okay, so Pater midine Adam ishum delo havi elagrama b'nizikin b'chayif b'dinei shamayim. So in that situation, Levi will be exempt from a mortal court, but he will be liable in a heavenly court. Now, why is Levi Pater? Levi, who instigated or sicked Shimon's dog against Ruvain's poodle, right? The reason is because Levi can say that all I've done is a grama. I didn't damage the animal. I just said sikkim. I just said a few words, and that animal went ahead on its own and attacked Reuven's poodle. Okay, so therefore, Levi can claim that he's pater midinei adam, but knowing that his uh, act of instigating the pit bull is going to cause damage, he's chayiv b'dinei shamayim. And finally, what about the owner of the pit bull? Ubal hakelev chayiv chatzi nezek. So he's going to be liable for half damages. And that's generally the penalty that we assess upon any animal that acts violently, is half damages. The kaven shu yodea she'im mishasim et kalbo lahazik arehu no sheikh lo hayalo lahanicho. That since Shimon knows that his animal is prone to violence, and all it takes is a little bit of provocation to get the animal to get wild, then Shimon had an obligation to guard his animal from being sicked, and from being provoked. And the fact that Shimon either neglected to guard his dog or allowed Levi to instigate his dog, to provoke his dog, is in itself a liability on his part. So it sounds like if Shimon himself sicks the dog, he'll also only be liable for half, but he'll be liable all of it, medinei shamayim, right? But the fact of the matter is that there are damages that can be collected from an animal that is known to be violent. I remember growing up in California. I think the laws vary from state to state in the U.S., but in California, any dog is considered a wild animal that is naturally prone to attack. And therefore, if you own a dog, it doesn't matter how friendly and docile the dog is. If your dog bites someone, you are immediately liable for all damages. That's not the halacha in Shulchan Aruch, but that's the law in California. I don't know. Anyone know what the law is in Ontario? Just curious. But it would be interesting to explore that, and it could be that laws have changed over the years as more and more people are sympathetic to dog owners and the rights of people to have pets and treat them like members of their own family. Okay, so that's a brief synopsis of, it's just basically Hilchos Nizkei Behema, the laws of the types of damage that animals cause. Okay, all right, let us go on. So the next piece that we saw in Efshalo Lishmot, if it is at all possible, when your animal is getting attacked by your neighbor's animal, if you can gently pull your animal away, thus minimizing any damage to the attacking animal, then you're obligated to do so. If you didn't minimize the damage, and instead you just pushed the attacking animal and caused the attacking animal damage by pushing it, so then you're going to be liable if, like we said before in the biurim, that there was no extra exertion required on your behalf. The kasvu haposkim, and based on that, the poskim write, the shnei anoshim shemakim zeh ezeh, two guys get into a fist fight. Uba shlishi v'dachaf echad mehem, and a third party comes along, and in order to break up the fight, he pushes one of the two parties. And then that party, because he was pushed, ends up getting injured. He falls against something, breaks something. So yachol lasos lo din, mishum delo hayatzarich ledoch, v'hayachol l'shamto benachas. And so as a result of the guy breaking up the fight, he broke it up violently though. So if he ends up injuring me in the course of breaking up the fight, I can take him to court and I can sue him for my damages based on this very halacha. Why? Because he could have stopped the fight without doing it violently. So anytime you can stop something without violence and you use violence instead to stop it, you can be held liable. Now, remember, we had seen in the biurim, that's if there's no additional tircha involved, no extra exertion involved. Let's say two guys are fighting violently, and you're scared that if you try to get into the fray, they're going to punch you in the face also, because the fists are swinging back and forth. So if you can, and the only way, therefore, you can figure out a way to stop it is by hosing them down with water or doing some other kind of act. And in the course of hosing them down, one guy falls and slips and breaks his arm. So it's not so clear that in that case he could sue you. I don't know why I'm thinking of these crazy cases. I've never been involved in an altercation like this and had to break up a fight. But I guess maybe, it's conceivable because you watch enough cases on TV, right? So it all depends on how easy it was to break up the fight. If you feel that you would have been in danger by trying to break it up directly, and by breaking it up in a more, let's say, from a distance, you end up damaging someone, then you would not be held liable. Okay, let's go on to the next one.
Okay, if you're interested, I looked up the dog law in Ontario.
Okay.
I can just share what it says. It says that Ontario follows a strict liability rule when it comes to dog bite cases, making it relatively straightforward. The dog owner is liable for damages resulting from a bite or attack, and the liability of the owner does not depend on the knowledge of the propensity of the dog or fault or negligence on the part of the owner. But then it goes on to say, however, even though victims don't have to prove the dog owner was negligent, the courts will take a look at whether or not the victim was partly responsible for the attack.
For the provocation, right?
Yeah.
That's because sometimes you can provoke a dog, sure, absolutely.
Right, and I guess that would then take away from the liability of the owner.
Right, right. And I think that in California, there is no such proviso like that, or at least there was, because I had a dog and my dog was provoked and ended up biting someone. And we just decided, because it was a neighbor, we decided to just get rid of the dog. And we ended up giving it to someone on a farm, so the dog became a guard dog on a farm.
And paid the damages.
Well, I think they must have settled on something. I don't remember. It was so long ago. I was a child. Okay, so Yishmatenu B'nachas. Thank you for that, Paul.
Okay.
So Yishmatenu B'nachas, you should try to pull your animal away gently. Umikol makom im lo nizhar bazeh b'nafal ha'elyon v'meis. If, however, I wasn't careful to pull my animal away gently, and as a result of pulling them apart more quickly, or perhaps with more force, the animal on top fell and died. Yesh omrim depater hol v'lo dachafo la'elyon. So some say that because I didn't directly push the animal on top, but I rather just didn't use enough gentleness in getting my animal away, that caused the top animal to die indirectly as a result of my action. Some therefore say that I'm putter. Rak shomer shelo atach, because all I did was pull my animal out, and that caused the top animal to fall and really have a blunt force trauma. Ruvain shalokach kli shel Shimon v'samach bo chaviso shel yayin shelo yipol. Now he gives us another case, which is brought by the Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch. Reuven takes a utensil that belongs to Shimon, and he uses it to support his barrel of wine to prevent it from falling. So I've taken something that doesn't belong to me and use it to protect my property. Uba Shimon v'natal kli shelo v'nishbar hachavish shel yayin. And Shimon sees his widget is being used as some kind of stopper or holder. And he basically says, I don't care about Reuven's wine. He takes his property and brings it back into his house. So Shimon chayev. So the halacha is that even though Reuven used Shimon's widget illegally, Shimon is still going to be chayev in that case. Because you can't just wantonly cause damage to your friend's property, even though he's protecting his property. I mean, I guess what I would imagine is like this. Let's say a guy has a wagon or some kind of like, I know my neighbor has a thing that he hitches to the back of his car that hauls things. And when it's not hitched to a car, he just puts these bricks behind each wheel in the driveway to prevent it from rolling back. So I go ahead and I say, hey, one of those bricks is from my house. Those are my bricks. What does he think he's doing? And I go ahead and I pull the bricks away, and I don't care what happens to the wagon, and it just rolls out into the street and either it gets damaged or it damages the car that's parked on the other side of the street or whatever it is. He says, I'm liable for doing that. What right did I have? Even though those bricks belong to me, I still don't have a right just to pull them out without putting in something else to replace them. Provided that there's no damage, there's no extra exertion, significant exertion involved. Let me get another brick. Let me get something to replace it. I'm obligated to do that, and if I don't, then I'm going to be liable, provided that it's not a situation where the brick that he used is not a brick at all, but let's say it's a very valuable object that weighs like a bar of gold of mine, and he's used it to stop the wagon. And I'm worried that that bar of gold is going to be stolen. And I can't find another rock. Well, he shouldn't have taken my bar of gold, or, other examples like that. Anyway, we'll hold it here for